ASME Section 9 Overview Part 1. I'm going to do a little deeper dive into ASME Section 9, give a little oversight, my thoughts, where I've done battle with other engineers, inspectors, designers on this section of the code. I've worked with this one off and on for the last 20 some years. The skeleton of this code overview is from Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I started with their slides and then started adding slides where I thought new slides needed to be or other material needs to be touched on. So theirs is the Introduction to Welding and Technology courses, code courses, Module 1F. My name's Gary Pace. I'm a professional engineer in the state of Texas and CWI. Here's the acknowledgments. The information I'm going to use is out there in the public space. I just borrowed it from the U.S. government. It's our money at work anyway, so what the heck. But this is from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission Introduction to Welding Technology and Code course. You can see the website that you'd need to go to get it. Also, CanTeach is public domain educational and reference library on CANDU technology. It's a Canadian deuterium uranium. So like it says here, this is good information for people on a budget, and it's good info. But I took their slides and wheedled out a bunch of stuff and kind of compressed it down so it's not, 50 slides. Maybe we'll get it down to 20 some, and it'll be useful information to people trying to understand PQRs and WPSs and the alphabet soup that's associated with those. Okay, so if you go into Section 9, I'm working off the 2013 version. Section 9 has a foreword, right? In 1911, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers established the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Committee to formulate standard rules for the construction of steam boilers and other pressure vessels. In 2009, the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Committee was superseded by the following committees. So what does that passage mean? Well, it means back in the early 1900s, 1900 to 1911, and even in the late 1800s, they had a lot of boiler explosions. Anybody could cobble together a boiler, heat a building, heat a house, heat a factory, and they had a lot of boiler explosions because there was no rules. There was no nationwide set of rules. So the American Society of Mechanical Engineers got together and built the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Committee, the standard rules for construction that said, okay, these are the rules. If you're going to build these, this is how you got to do it. You can't just be a blacksmith in a shop somewhere in Pig's Knuckle, Arkansas, or Oklahoma or New York. I got some metal here, I'm going to make a boiler. No, they made rules. So from that point on, the number of boiler explosions drastically decreased. That's why we have all the ASME boiler and pressure vessel codes. All the various different codes for anything doing with boilers and pressure vessels. Section 1, Rules for the Construction of Power Boilers. Section 2, Materials. Part A is Non-Ferrous Material Specifications. Part B, Non-Ferrous Material Specifications. Part C, Specifications for welding rods, electrodes, and filler metals. Part D, Properties, Customary. Part D, Properties, Metric. Section 3, Rules for Construction of Nuclear Facility Components. Section 4, Rules for Construction of Heating Boilers. Section 5, Non-Destructive Examination. Section 6, Recommended Rules for the Care and Operation of Heating Boilers. Section 7, Recommended Guidelines for the Care of Power Boilers. Section 8, Rules for Construction of Pressure Vessels. Section 9, Welding, Brazing, and Fusing Qualifications. Section 10, Fiber-Reinforced Plastic Pressure Vessels. Section 11, Rules for In-Service Inspection of Nuclear Power Plant Components. Section 12, Rules for Construction of Continued Service of Transport Tanks. So basically what ASME code committees did was break everything down into a number of different sections that are very specific to a certain scope for a certain type of pressure vessels and or materials. ASME, unlike other codes, has everything broken out. So you've got a construction code that you're working to. So you can see those on the right, like ASME B31.1 or B31.3 or ASME Section 1. You've got all those on one side. And then you've got the other, which are the reference documents. Section 2 is materials. That's where all your welding rod specifications, all your material specifications for plate, pipe, all that stuff. All those kinds of materials are in Section 2. Section 5 is the rules for non-destructive examination. It's a whole big section, and it talks about nothing but non-destructive examination. Your construction codes are the rules for your specific slice of whatever you're building, whatever the scope of what you're building is. Section 1 is power boilers. Section B30 or B31.1 is power piping. You know, you've got all these things broken out. So ASME, it's such an extensive set of codes, they've broken it out into different sections so that each section can specify on what it does best. And it contains that information and that information only. Another slice of the foreword. The committee's function is to establish rules of safety relating only to pressure integrity which govern the construction of boilers, pressure vessels, transport tanks, the nuclear components, and the in-service inspection of nuclear components and transport tanks. The committee also interprets these rules when questions arise regarding their intent. This means that this code doesn't cover things like hydraulic cylinders. I used to work for a hydraulic cylinder outfit back in the day, and they'd get all caught up in this, and I was trying to explain to them, hey, this code doesn't cover hydraulic cylinders. You're making hydraulic cylinders that go on tractors. This is for big pressure vessel stuff. This is for boilers and pressure vessels, tanks, transport tanks, nuclear stuff. This doesn't cover what you guys are doing. Used to go round and round about it. Well, it's the welding code. Well, it's not an all-encompassing thing. It's not like the speed limit. It's the speed limit. No, it's just a very specific code. It's the speed limit for this little slice of highway that you're driving on. It isn't an all-encompassing set of rules that cover everything. This is, boilers, pressure vessels, transport tanks, nuclear components. That's what this covers. The ASME codes. And then we're going to get into Section 9, which is the qualification of welders to do all of this welding on boilers, pressure vessels, transport tanks, and nuclear components. Okay, I mentioned D1.1 and a couple other codes, so we're going to do a little sidebar here and then talk about D1.1 for just a couple of slides. D1.1, here's the scope. This code contains the requirements for fabricating and erecting welded steel structures. When this code is stipulated in contract documents, conformance with all the provisions of this code shall be required except for those provisions that the engineer or contract documents specifically modify or exempt. Structural steel, D1.1. They're not dealing with pressure vessels. D1.1 is a complete code. It is different from the ASME codes in that AWS D1.1 contains everything in one code. It's got the non-destructive testing, it's got your testing, it's got design criteria, it's everything in one construction code. You don't have to bounce back and forth between Section 1, which would be boilers, construction of boilers, to Section 9 for your qualification of welders, and then Section 5 for your non-destructive testing. AWS D1.1 has it all in one book, whereas the ASME codes, you got to bounce back and forth between Section 5, Section 9, and then whatever construction code you're working to. And here you can see the table of contents for AWS D1.1. So you can see everything is contained in here, whereas ASME codes have everything broken out into different areas. Here you've got the general requirements, design of welded connections, pre-qualification of WPSs, qualification, fabrication, inspection, stud welding, strengthening and repair of existing structures, tubular structures. AWS D1.1 has everything contained in one document. The ASME codes are way too expansive to cover everything in one document. AWS D1.1, carbon steel. That's the only material you're working with. You're welding structural steel, a very specific list of steels, whereas the ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, they're dealing with everything. You could be building a pressure vessel out of titanium, carbon steel, stainless steel, a combination of everything. So their codes are, like I said, broken up. AWS, American Welding Society D1.1, is a very specific code. It deals with structural steel. Carbon steel, that's it. You're not building anything out of titanium. You're not building anything out of nickel. You are just dealing with structural steels, and you are using it for structural components. You're not building bridges. You're not building airplanes. You're just building structural components or structures. You're constructing buildings with this code. You're not building pressure vessels. You're not building anything else. I used to go the rounds with engineers in the past. Oh, they'd see AWS D1.1. Oh, it's the welding code. Can you weld hydraulic cylinders to this for tractors and man lifts? No, this is for structural steel, buildings. That's it. You don't use it for anything else. So there's a lot of times confusion with this, and I'm trying to clarify that. Another welding code people run across a lot of times is API 1104, welding of pipelines and related facilities. So here's the scope out of API 1104. This standard covers the gas and arc welding of butt, fillet, and socket welds in carbon and low alloy steel piping used in the compression, pumping, and transmission of crude petroleum, petroleum products, fuel gases, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and where applicable, covers welding on distribution systems. Do you see anything in here about pressure vessels or structural steel? No, very specific code. Tells you the kinds of welds you can make on low alloy steel piping, carbon and low alloy steel piping used in compression, pumping, and transmission of crude petroleum and petroleum products. Carbon and low alloy steel. It doesn't talk about nickel alloys. It doesn't talk about stainless steels. This is very specific, right? And it tells you crude petroleum, petroleum products. We're not talking about hydraulic cylinders going on tractors in the state of Iowa for John Deere. Very specific. So when you're using, I guess the caveat out of this slide is, while we're on this sidebar, is you need to look at whatever code you're working to and make sure that what you're building is covered by what the scope of that code is. This standard also covers the procedures for radiographic, magnetic particle, liquid penetrant, and ultrasonic testing, as well as the acceptance standards to be applied to production welds tested to destruction or inspected by radiographic, magnetic particle, liquid penetrant, ultrasonic, and visual testing methods. So this code has pretty much everything you need in one code. It also has the non-destructive testing criteria for welding on pipelines and related facilities. Whereas the ASME codes, Section 5 covers the ASME Section 5 covers the non-destructive testing criteria. So, like I said, I'm trying to give you a little idea that American Society of Mechanical Engineers, they've got their codes broken out into different sections. This one, API 1104, has everything rolled up into one. It's got your standard for the procedures of radiographic, mag particle, the NDE, rolled into one document. Whereas in ASME, you've got to go from Section 9, which is qualification of welders. For NDE, you need to go non-destructive examination, you need to go over to Section 5. Or for the construction, you'd need to go to whatever code you're working to. Section 1, power boilers, or B31 power piping, or B31.3. There's other codes that are going to give you this information. So you need to, when you start dealing with these various codes, you need to realize that structurally they're set up different from each other. This one is a very focused code. API 1104 is welding of pipelines and related facilities using low carbon steel. That's it. We're not building a nuclear power plant with this one. We're not building bridges. We're just welding pipelines and related facilities. A very specific code. Overview of ASME Section IX, Welding and Brazing Qualifications. The primary purpose for procedure qualification is to verify the compatibility of materials and techniques to result in sound weld with acceptable properties. The WPS is the instruction to a welder, and the PQR is qualified by mechanical testing and is documentation of mechanical testing. So to qualify a welding procedure, the weld must be destructively tested. You can see I've spiced this slide up with a couple of pictures of, in the middle there's some Sharpie impacts. On the right there's some bend tests. And then on the far left you can see some tensile tests. So these are probably the three biggest, most common tests that you're going to run across when trying to qualify a weld procedure, depending on what you're doing, what the end use of the component is, what the construction codes call out that need to be done. But bottom line is a PQR is going to be destructively tested, and it's going to be documentation of the mechanical properties during that destructive testing. Okay, if we start at part QG, general requirements, this is going to give us the scope for QG. This section contains requirements for the qualification of welders, welding operators, brazers, brazing operators, plastic fusing operators, and material joining processes they use during welding, brazing, and fusing operations for the construction of components under the rules of ASME Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, the ASME B31 codes for pressure piping, and other code standards and specifications that reference this section. We're not doing pipelines for 1104, API 1104, and we're not doing structural steel. This covers the ASME codes. ASME Section 9 contains the requirements for the qualification of welders, welding operators, brazers, brazing operators. I'm not just going to let you know, if you're coming here for brazing information or plastic fusing, I'm not going there. I have zero expertise as far as plastic or brazing. I've never dealt with it. I'm pretty much a welding guy, been heavily involved in welding for the last couple decades, so we're just going to stay, I'm going to stay in my swim lane and not venture off into brazing world or plastic fusing operators. Part QG, general requirements. QG 100 scope. This section is divided into 4 parts. So they're telling us ASME Section 9 is divided into 4 parts. Part QG contains general requirements for all material joining processes. Part QW contains requirements for welding. Part QB contains requirements for brazing. Part QF contains requirements for plastic fusing. I'm not covering section or part QB or QF. I'm going to cover part QG and part QW, the requirements for welding. But basically what this is telling us is the area we're in, we're starting this little slideshow is part QG, which is the general requirements for all materials. So what we're covering in today's slideshow, or I guess YouTube video, covers QW, QB, QF. This is all the common material that is used in QW, QB, and QF. So part QG covers QW, QB, QF. It's all the common material is what this is saying. But ASME Section 9 is divided into 4 parts. So we're going to delve into QW. Before we get into this, we need to understand the terminology. WPS is a welding procedure specification. It's qualified instructions on how to complete the weld. It is a recipe card that you give to the welder that tells him how to make the weld. It is how you bake the chocolate chip cookies. How much chocolate chips are required, how much sugar, butter, salt, whatever. How long you cook it for. Those are all things that are written on the WPS. They are the instructions that tell the welder how to complete the weld. The PQR is a procedure qualification record. It's a record of welding parameters and test results. So that is the parameters and the test results that we used the first time we made chocolate chip cookies. The very first time. We put them in the oven for a certain amount of time. It is the recipe that we used. So it is going to be the backup documentation for the WPS. And then we've got a WPQ, which is a welder performance qualification. This is a record of welder test results and ranges of approval. We're not going to get into that today because that's a whole nother animal, but I just wanted to address it here and say that welder qualifications, they do exist, but they are not a part of a WPS and PQR. That's a whole different world. So realize that welder performance qualification paperwork and documentation does exist, but it does not influence the PQR and the WPS. Part QG, General Requirements. QG 106, Organizational Responsibility. This is going to tell us, what the company's responsibility is. QG 106.1, Procedure Qualification. Each organization is responsible for conducting the tests required by this section to qualify the procedures that are used in the construction of components under the rules of the codes, standards, and specifications that reference this section. This is telling me that I can't borrow somebody else's procedure qualifications. That if I own a welding company, I am responsible, my company, for doing my procedure qualifications. Whether I farm it out to, there's some subtleties there which I won't talk to, but I am responsible. I can't go to another company, Fred's Welding and Auto across town, and say, hey, Fred, can I borrow your procedure qualifications and use them in my welding procedure specification? I can't. I am required. Each organization is responsible for conducting the tests required by this section. So I have to do it. My company has to do it. I can't borrow somebody else's procedures. I can have somebody else do my welding, but they weld it if they're qualified and they have the qualifications, but I can't borrow their procedures. I can't say, oh, they wrote and qualified a procedure. I'm going to borrow theirs for this one job and then give it back. So each company or organization is responsible for conducting the tests required by this section. Can't borrow somebody else's PQRs. You could borrow it, look at it, get an idea of what you need to do to weld it, and then go qualify your own, but you can't just borrow their paperwork. Organizational responsibility continued. Performance qualification. Each organization is responsible for the supervision and control of material joining performed by persons for whom they have operational responsibility and control. The organization shall conduct the tests required by this section to qualify the performance of those persons with each joining process they will use for the construction of components under the rules of the codes, standards, and specifications that reference this section. This requirement ensures that the qualifying organization has determined that the personnel using its procedures are capable of achieving the minimum requirements specified for an acceptable joint. This responsibility cannot be delegated to another organization. So if I have welding procedures, I can't delegate this to another organization, another company, and still weld under my welding program. I've got to have responsible control and supervision of the materials joining. I can't use another organization's procedures and their people and then use my welding program. I could subcontract the whole thing out and have them weld it, but then it gets back to it's under their supervision and control. I can't borrow their procedures and their people to make a weld under my welding program. I've got to have control of it. I've got to have my guys welding it, my procedures, my welding procedure specifications, my procedure qualification records, and the people need to be qualified under my welding program, my supervision and control. You can't, if a welder is qualified for Fred's Welding and Barbecue across the street, and he's got the qualifications to weld exactly what I need, I've got to retest him when he comes into my organization. He could be the best welder for an organization across the street, and I hire him for 3 days to weld on my stuff. I can't use another company's welding welder performance qualifications. I've got to do my own welder performance qualifications. So I have to qualify my welders and be responsible to them. I can't subcontract that out and then use those welders under my welding program. Ownership transfers. Organizations may maintain effective operational control of PQRs, procedure specifications, and performance qualifications under different ownership than existed during the original procedure qualification. When an organization or some part thereof is acquired by a new owner, the PQRs, procedure specifications, and performance qualification records may remain valid for use by the new owners without requalification, and the new owner's PQRs, procedure specifications, and performance qualification records become valid for use by the acquired organization, provided all of the following requirements have been met. The new owner takes responsibility for the procedure specifications and performance qualification records. The procedure specifications and performance qualification records have been revised to reflect the name of the new owners. The quality control system quality assurance program documents the original source of the PQR's procedure specifications and performance qualification records as being from the original qualifying organization. So basically this is saying I can absorb another company's WPSs and PQRs if I do these three things. I need to take responsibility for those procedure specifications and say, yep, they're ours, we're taking them. The second thing here says the procedure specifications and performance qualification records have been revised to reflect the new name of the owner. So you go through all the documents and you just stamp them with something that says, yep, we bought them out. Scratch out the old guy's name and put in the new guy's name. So you went from Fred's Welding and Auto to Marvin's Barbecue and Welding. So you go from one company to another. You scratch that out, you take responsibility for it, you put your names in the documentation. The quality control system documents the original source of the PQRs. So you need to document where all this stuff came from. So the new company has to document, hey, we got all these WPSs and PQRs, all these procedure qualification records for procedure qualification records, and then welder performance qualification records. They were done prior to us purchasing them under this other program. This is where it comes from. So this is just saying, we can use somebody else's purchased company's WPSs, PQRs, and welder qualifications, but we have to keep our paperwork in order, letting any auditor or somebody that comes after us know where these came from. So I'm going to try to do this with some graphics and explain ownership transfers. Here we have two standalone companies. You can see ASME Welding is on the right. We've got the Umbrella Corporation on the left. So they've each got their own set of WPSs and numbering systems and their own PQRs that support their WPSs. We can't use these as standalone companies They're independent corporations. Umbrella Corporation can't go over and use a WPS from ASME Welding. ASME Welding can't go use a PQR in Umbrella Corporation's universe that they've got for one of their WPSs or PQRs. But if Umbrella Corporation acquires ASME Welding, purchases them, so Umbrella Corporation purchases ASME Welding. Well, what does that mean for us? Now ASME Welding and Umbrella Corporation are all part of the Umbrella Corporation now. This happens all the time in companies where one company will buy another one. Well, that means that we can mix and match now, meaning that I can use Umbrella Corporation WPSs over at ASME Welding, or ASME Welding can use a WPS over at Umbrella Corporation. So now that the Umbrella Corporation has purchased ASME Welding, both corporations, if they follow all the rules, can use the other corporation's welding procedures and or procedure qualification records. Or let's say ASME Welding has a bunch of procedure qualification records that are used for, let's say, heat treating, and Umbrella Corporation never had those before. Umbrella Corporation could use one of their PQRs and a PQR from ASME Welding to write a completely new welding procedure specification with the new acquired company's material and their material. QG 108 qualifications made to previous editions. So the boiler and pressure vessel codes get updated every 3 years, depending on, I think it's 3 years. And then they put out addenda every year or so. Joining procedures, procedure qualifications, and performance qualifications that were made in accordance with additions and addenda to this section as far back as 1962 edition may be used in any construction for which the current edition has been specified. Joining procedures, procedure qualifications, and performance qualifications that were made in accordance with additions and addenda of this section prior to 1962 edition may be used in any construction for which the current edition has been specified, provided the requirements of the 1962 edition or later editions have been met. So this is telling us that if I qualified a procedure qualification record in 1965 for 7018, and maybe there were some minor changes in the code, but I can use that procedure qualification record to write a new WPS, or I can use my old WPSs that went back to 1965, as long as it's in accordance with, that were made with, in accordance with the 1962 edition. Anything that's any WPSs and PQRs prior to 1962, it's got to meet the specific requirements provided by the 1962 edition or later. So any of the really, really old stuff from the 40s and 50s, 30s, it's got to meet the requirements of today. 62 edition and coming forward, it doesn't have to meet those conditions. As long as it was qualified from 1962 to today, you're good to go with those procedure qualifications or personnel qualifications, as long as they were qualified to an edition from 62 to now. Okay, that's the summary. This didn't cover anything in regards to welding procedures or PQRs. It just kind of sets the table and says that part QG, which is qualification general, I think, it's the general requirements, but this applies to welding, brazing, and plastics. And we're just going to talk about welding in the next couple of areas, couple of videos that I put together. We'll just talk about welder qualification, procedure qualification, materials, and those kinds of issues with ASME Section 9. I don't know anything about brazing or the qualification of plastics. I'm not going to go in that direction. I've never dealt with it in the 20-some years I've been dealing with Section 9. So somebody else wants to tackle that mission that has the subject matter expertise, go for it. But So that's where I'm going to leave off today. And then in my next installment, we'll talk about procedure qualifications, welder qualifications, WPSs, and what this whole alphabet soup of welding documentation really means, and how do we attack it, or how do we deal with it in our professional lives. Here's my contact information. You know, if you got questions, want to bounce something off me in regards to, hey, how do I do this? What's going on? WPS, PQRs. I also do welding consulting. But anyways, if you have questions in regards to WPSs and PQRs, don't be afraid to lob me an email and ask a question.